Meico, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing good. Welcome back to another episode of Mindful Techie Tuesdays.
Yes, excited to be here. Excited that you are hosting us. And as always, you've done a great job with setting up the studio and getting us prepared for what is going to be, I think, another exciting conversation today about a topic that I think we can all connect with if we are finding ourselves working from home more or just more connected to our devices than we ever have been before, given the current context in which we're operating. So I'm excited that our guest, who's has a lot of experience in this area, is going to be able to share with us some things that we can do to make the most of the situation that we're in.
Yeah, super excited for today's conversation. Given COVID-19, right, a lot of our nonprofit groups or just companies in general have resorted to remote work environment or setups, and managing virtual teams. So I think today is going to be an awesome conversation around just what's good, the bad, and the ugly of virtual team management. So I'm going to go ahead and bring Ash Shepard onto the screen here, and maybe you can help do some intro of him, and then we'll give him the time to share his thoughts as well.
All right, so awesome. So Ash, welcome. We're excited to have you. And for folks that are joining us that are new to this conversation, I want to invite you to like, love, and share this conversation. Tag someone if you think it would be useful for them, and interact with us in the comments. We want to hear from you. We want to hear your comments and your questions. So please do those things and engage with us in that way. And I'm excited to have Ash on this call, a colleague from NTEN. He's the chief program officer, all around great guy, and really systematic in his approach to distributed work. And just getting things done and moving the ball and managing virtual teams. So I'm excited that he's going to be here today to share some pearls of wisdom with us. And hopefully you'll be able to take something away from this conversation. So Ash, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Oh, yes. Thank you for having me. I've known Meico for a number of years now. I've been able to work in lots of capacities. And so I'm excited because when you reached out to me, I knew right away that this was going to be a conversation that got to like the real aspect of working remotely, managing remotely. It was going to move beyond all the kind of clickbaity stuff that's flooded the world in the last couple of months of like, make sure you put pants on. And, like when you go to work, you should be working. Is rooted in the reality, right? The context is so different than anything that anyone's experienced before. And I think that there's some basics, and then there's the like, and now how can we actually feel successful at it?
Yes.
Now more than ever at nonprofit organizations and other, other companies, our communities need us to still do amazing work. They need us to do work that's even more amazing than before.
Yes.
And so any way I can help contribute and help people feel like they can get back to like, let's actually do our best because our communities demand it. I'm happy to be a part of those conversations.
Well, awesome. So tell us, so as we dive in, and Carlos, if you want to chime in on this. So before we dive in, you mentioned community. So let's talk about the context in which we are situated right now. So we're talking about essentially a forced work from home, a forced homeschooling for many of us in the current environment, if we're fortunate enough to be able to have that privilege, right? To be able to have a safe place to work from home and to have the right equipment and essentials. So let's talk about that. And then I want to talk about specifically what's been happening over the last several weeks with the protests. But Ash, starting with you, how have you been impacted by this switch of, I guess, what I would call forced, permanent work from home as a result of COVID-19?
The shelter in place goodness.
Yes.
So I think it's interesting, right? Because there's lots of shifts and impacts. And so I've worked a total of about 8 years remotely over the years at 3 different organizations, but I've been working fully remote with NTEN for the last 3 years. So for a lot of folks, they were like, oh, this is easy, right? Nothing has changed for you. Well, I can tell you that in the last 3 years, I had 0 coworkers, right? And so now I have a partner who also has to work in the house full time with me, kids that normally are at school. are here, and they just finished this last week, but they were basically here. And I could say we're homeschooling, but that implies that I was doing any teaching. And the reality is my kids were self-teaching themselves through the last bits of 2nd and 6th grade. So it's very different. And so for me, some of the real big shifts is that, you know, as you and I have talked many times, Meico, the importance of balancing technology and space and break from it. That for me, one of the biggest shifts is that the reason working remotely works well for me is because I actually have very little tech that gets into my personal life and my personal space.
Yes.
And so the way I keep that balance and I'm able to be here and focused and successful during the work time is that when work is done, I'm done. Like over the last few years, I don't do a ton in social networks. I don't do a bunch in my free time. When I eat lunch every day, it is intentionally away from a machine. Like that is very clear. I am not looking at any screens for, 30 minutes while I'm eating lunch. And so for me, it's been hard because as the rest of the world shifted and we're like, let's do a social happy hour through Zoom, or even internally as a team, is they're like, well, let's all eat lunch together one day. It's been rough because normally I'm all about those social things, but I got to maintain that hard boundary and be like, when I eat lunch, it doesn't involve a screen.
Yes.
Because if I can't keep that balance, everything else suffers. I won't be productive in the rest of my work if I start also hating my laptop.
Yes.
So for me, the big shift is like feeling isolated in new ways, and that like people want to connect by Zoom, like personal friends or even through work. And I'm just like, I actually can't, because if I do any more tech in my day, it's going to burn me out in ways it'll be hard to recover from, knowing that there isn't like an end point. It's not like, oh, tough it out for 2 more weeks. Like, I don't know. This could be it for 8 months, 12 months. I don't know. I have no idea.
So that's really, really powerful. And I think you dropped a lot of gems and nuggets that I want to come back to. And so I want to layer on top of this. So what's happening with the current environment, right? So the protests in response to the recent killing of George Floyd. And before we were coming on, you were talking about where you're situated in Oregon and how you are removed physically from that, but obviously you're getting news and information. So can you talk about how that has impacted your experience working from home?
Yeah, so I think what's challenging about that, again, like we shared, I live in this small town in Southern Oregon. It's right on the border with California. So there's the pluses and minuses of living in small towns, which I've learned over the span of my life, in that it's small. It is isolated in lots of ways. But when we have these kind of big national moments to create this sort of connection and really feel like you can affect change, that's not happening down here in this tiny town in Southern Oregon. So in that sense, it's been tough to feel isolated, which means in my personal time, I do have to go and sort of spend time in news and things like that, just to have some sort of sense of what's going on.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing is realizing that like that triple layered cake, right? Cake. I try and make it sound nice by calling it cake, but it's mud pie at best. But you got COVID, you got the economic impacts that like rapidly hit and will be here for a while. And you got all the social justice issues that are coming on. And so the biggest shift for me is just trying to really practice that self-reflection skill and being able to recognize that being productive, right past Ash on Monday morning, mapped out when I was going to do what things during the week. Also on Tuesday at 2, I'm going to focus on this. And just being able to own that when I hit 2 o'clock on Tuesday, like now, it just happens quite frequently that my brain is like, nope, I can't possibly process or put mental energy into this just like work thing.
Yes.
Like, I need space to just go and deal with these larger issues. And so rather than pretending like I overcome, Ash, be strong and overcome like it's a distraction, but it's not a distraction. So being able to say like, past me had good intentions, but current me knows this is not where I need to put my thoughts and energy right now. So I just don't, so being able to spot that in a matter of moments rather than wasting an hour, which then makes me feel even worse. Cause I'm like, now I had a whole hour where I was unproductive, right? That like industrial revolutionary term of like what being productive means. So giving myself the space to be like, I'm going to step out. I'm not going to do anything useful in the next hour. So rather, let me go focus on what I need to, and then I'll come back later when my mind is in that space and I'll be able to produce good work. I'll be able to do something that's useful for my team and the communities we serve, and just kind of me personally.
So you mentioned something that I think is really important. You talked about how I would summarize what you just said in terms of creating space for yourself and giving yourself permission to do what you need to do with that particular space based on what's happening around you externally. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into that and ask you if you could briefly describe, for those folks who don't know, what is NTEN and what's your role there? And you talked about the things that you're doing for yourself as an individual, but you manage a team at NTEN. So how are you helping your team to create space?
Yeah, so NTEN, we're a nonprofit, and essentially we help other nonprofits learn how to use technology so they can be more efficient and effective, whatever it is they're trying to accomplish through their mission. And so we do that in a variety of ways, through professional development, through building community. Essentially, it comes down to our 3 pillars, right? Learn, connect, change. And what I really love about NTEN is that there's equal weight put on all 3 of those. So we want people to get good content and build those skills, but that actually isn't going to make any change happen unless we can also reinforce connection and community. And through that combination, we'll actually help communities get better. We'll help organizations be more efficient and effective at what they're doing. And so in my role, I oversee our program side of things. So that includes everything from our large conference that happens every year, the Nonprofit Technology Conference, to our 2 professional certificates that we offer. And then we have some 6-month cohort programs. Then we have a year-long digital inclusion fellowship program. And so sort of my role is to help set kind of vision, direction, help build out and support the folks that then go and help implement all of those various programs. And so to the second part of your question there, I do this in a weird combination. So before COVID and all that, it was, I'm remote. And so I managed people who were both in the office and are full-time remote as well.
Yes.
So there's definitely some challenges that come with that. So there's lots of tips and tricks under normal circumstances. But some of the things that have come up for me in the current reality that's been really important to note is that from my own perspective, right, that kind of selfish view, everyone's remote, right?
Yeah.
For me, it's always a video call.
Yes.
And so trying to really be empathetic and mindful of the fact that those people that I normally manage who work in the office, this is new. And to be honest, it's not something they asked for or volunteered into for who knows what reasons. People have all kinds of reasons they do or don't want to work remote. And so really trying to be empathetic around those simple things like how's your, everything from how's your setup? Do you need a different mouse? Do you need a standing adjusting desk thing? To do we need to adjust your schedule? How can we create that flexibility and space to understand that different people on the team are affected differently by the context of what's happening, right? Like I'm down here in Southern Oregon and my family lives in certain parts of the country. Other folks on the team have family members that live in Baltimore, live in DC, and are, far more directly impacted by a lot of these things. And so how do we create a space where it's safe to say, focus on work when you want to focus on work? And if you need to go focus on those things, if you could, I'm sure you jump on a plane and head home and be a part of those things. So how do I allow space just for the fact that like, you can't even go home right now, which is where ultimately it would be best for you to be. So trying to be real empathetic around that sort of stuff has been something I think is an important shift.
And that's key, right? You said that's really powerful. You talked about essentially acknowledging, if I'm reflecting back what I hear you say, is that acknowledging the context in which people are operating. And, as you mentioned, being empathetic to the situation that folks are in and recognizing that the place that you come from, right, and what's working for you might not be the same place that someone else is operating from. I think that's critical. And one thing I would add to this, and I wonder if you would agree with this based on the context in which you're operating, sometimes I find that the simple acknowledgement of that is enough. Right? Because people aren't necessarily looking for you to solve their problem. They just want you to acknowledge that it's just a different reality for them. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think like you're saying, not trying to solve problems is super important, because being empathetic doesn't mean having all the answers. Mm-hmm. A lot of times it's just acknowledging and just saying, I don't know what you're going through. I just want you to know that whatever is the approach that makes you feel the most supported, let's do that. And letting them help dictate that for them. Because again, it's not like they might not even know what the answers are, but simply knowing that however we all kind of bumble through this big void of unknown, we got that trust, right? We know that like, however, like I might try something for a week, and if it doesn't work, you're going to be just fine the following week to say, cool, let's switch it up. Let's adjust your schedule. Let's adjust what you're working on. It's just trying to be human in that sense. Because I think there's a lot of people in this trap where they're, like you're saying, they want to, as a manager, I should have all the answers.
Yes.
Why? Nobody in our lifetime has been in this context. Like anyone who tells you they have all the answers is just a bold-faced liar. Like there's no way they know. Just being able to live in that realistic space, I think, just feels more human and genuine.
So what advice do you have for someone that they're not necessarily in a leadership role, that whether we think about it as a manager or director, and their manager is one of those managers that is like, I have all the answers, right? And here's the way we're going to do this. What advice do you have for someone who is reporting to that person for getting what they need? Because you gave a scenario in which, like, you know, Ash is a great guy, you know, he's a great boss. I can talk to Ash. Ash is checking in with me. But what if you don't have that kind of boss? What do you do? Yeah,
so this is where honestly they're kind of like human workarounds, right? They're like human
workarounds.
Human workarounds.
Hashtag human workarounds.
So it's basically like anytime you have more than two humans interacting, right, there's a potential for it to go messy. That's the way humans are. And so, you know, there's a lot of external information and things to talk about what's valuable as you make this shift. And so some of it is a real shift from like in-person real-time kind of work and collaboration, and that's where things get produced, to allowing people to work asynchronously. So it's like, look, when it works on your schedule, you can work on it. And so then you really come together for the real-time stuff to say, we all did our work. So now we're just going to kind of talk through the next steps and help process it. So to be honest, that can be an easy workaround. So a boss who doesn't allow that freedom, doesn't support it, you can come with this argument and be like, look, there's lots of external information to back up that I need to be able to work asynchronously, that we should have a real heavy focus on deliverables and outcomes as opposed to like tracking time and the process of doing tasks. So it can become a way to be like, and this is what everyone's saying is best practice and advice. And ultimately what it can do is it gives you a way to create that freedom in a way that doesn't feel like it's sort of in conflict with a boss. You can be like, I'm sure you already knew this because you've got all the answers. So I'm just saying, here's a way that we could do that thing. And then it's a way to play that game to say like, I'm not undercutting you, but I'm going to create a space where like, you can't micromanage me here.
So this is solid goal. So for folks that are listening to this, and if you are reporting to a manager that is inflexible and you're trying to shift the dynamics, you know, I'm going to reflect back to you what I think I heard you say. So one of the things you talked about in terms of getting to this place of freedom is making this argument for being asynchronous, right? So not having to do it concurrently, but being asynchronous, right? And making the argument for that by actually providing evidence, right? Providing evidence based on, you know, what other best practices or other folks are following, and being able to bring that concretely to your boss. So that's one thing I heard you say, Ash. Another thing I heard you say is about the importance of folks focusing on what the outcomes are that your boss wants you to get to, right? So if your boss is focused on a specific outcome, making sure that you are showing how you're going to get to that outcome with this new approach. And I think part of the getting to the outcome has to do with understanding what your boss's intention is, right? Like what are they trying to get to? Is that right?
Yeah, it's one of the cornerstones of getting buy-in on anything, right? Is you start from those shared goals and shared outcomes. Whether you're talking a new technology or you're talking a new work process or team structure, you know, when you start from a point, you'd be like, so based on our values, we all agree on this, right? And everyone goes, oh, yeah. And you're like, great. So this is simply an approach that helps us operationalize those values.
Yes.
And then all you're really doing is you're sort of negotiating over that 20%, but everyone's on board for the 80%. So it's this way to kind of work around the first initial phases of change management of like dread and fear and concern. You're like, So I'm just saying this thing still gets us to the place you want us to go. And it's like, oh yeah, because honestly, again, it's sort of forcing, knowing the messiness of humans is like, nobody is going to come back and say, well, I don't actually agree with our organization's values, or I don't agree with our mission. And it's like, all right, so I'm going to put you in a spot where then I can leverage that common ground to move through this part quickly. And you're going to let me try a different approach because, we're all going to arrive at the same destination on the other side. I just took a side road on this road trip. We all arrived where we needed to on time. So you don't need to worry about me stopping off to check out the world's largest ball of twine or whatever I had to do on my side road. We all got to the destination.
And then you have to deliver, right? So after you've made the case, then you have to deliver, right?
I was going to say that's the trick, right? It's nice to say that at some high level, like a Hallmark card. But to be honest, my number one strategy as a remote employee over these years, whether I was just an employee or a manager, is honestly, it just comes down to the fact I get shit done.
Yes.
Like I have a laser focus on however I have to get there, whatever I do to do it. Like people don't always know what I'm doing. And especially when you're remote, like a lot of the work itself is invisible, but people see the outcomes and people know that if I say I'm going to get something done, I'm going to get it done. And if I'm struggling at any point along the way, I'm going to immediately try and pull in others to help contribute and collaborate. And so they get to see where it's happening. So honestly, the biggest, you get a lot of leeway if you get it done. And so I think that's one of the big challenges is that with the triple layer mud cake right now, it's extremely hard to just get it done some days.
Yes.
So the biggest tip, the biggest strategy for remote work is also one of the biggest challenges right now.
Yeah, it's both, right? So you have to take care of yourself so that you can do the work. And I want to dive deeper into that in a moment, but I want to stay here for a second. So you talked about, you talked about delivering, and you talked about how sometimes when you're working remotely, people can't see what you're doing. And so one of the things I'm hearing from organizations that I'm working with is that folks are actually working more hours and not less, in part for a number of reasons. One is that we don't have the commute time that we had before, right? So folks are jumping into work and substituting that commute time for extra hours, thinking they can make up ground that's been lost by this transition. And then number two, part of that is, well, my boss can't see me, so maybe if I work extra hard, that will make up for that. So can you talk about how you actually, when people can't see the work that you're doing, how do you actually show your value, right? But before you get to the large outcome that you're getting to, right? So like you're planning this conference, like no one can see what you're doing until the conference is actually happening and people go to the conference, right? And know that it went well. But how do you show that you're actually doing stuff in the lead up to the conference? Yeah,
there's great points. Like you're saying, there's lots of studies that show being remote is more productive. So that's a big argument that people love to throw around right now. Like, oh, let's stay remote. People are more productive. There's also a ton of studies that show, because remote people typically give away hours. So I always try and remind folks that commute time, that was your time.
Yes.
Don't feel like just because you're not driving or riding a train or bus for those 2 hours a day, that somehow those 2 hours belong to the organization now.
Yes.
So to the main question there of how do I maintain kind of visibility or show that you're doing, there's the big outputs, there's the deliverables. Like you say, our conference is a 3-day event, happens in March, but the aspects of that I support and work on is happening for 10 months. So again, there's some high level tips I could share, but to be honest, there's some just real nitty gritty in the weeds, nerdy tactical tricks that I use as well. And so one of those, or one of the big ones that I do there is we have people across multiple time zones, all that kind of stuff. So in our main communication tools, which would be email, Slack, and then also, email, Slack, and instant messaging, which we
email, Slack, and instant messaging. So which platform are you using for instant messaging?
Well, we use mostly within Slack for that.
Okay.
And so what I do is I use scheduling. So a lot of people know this when it comes to social media platforms.
Yes.
But the reality is I use it on a daily basis for email and for Slack primarily. And so the thing is that I want to send a message, there's kind of two goals here. One is to get the message to the right person at the right time. So again, my coworkers that work on the East Coast, they're showing up at different times of the day. So both within Slack and with email, I'll have a message and I'll schedule it to only show or post when I know they're like coming out of a meeting, or it's the right moment for them to be able to see it, read it, and do something with it. But I also use it as a strategy to maintain visibility. So I may come on in the morning and I may schedule a couple things to post in Slack throughout the day. So the reality is, even if I go head down and I'm just working all day, every couple of hours, something pops up with one or multiple people to see me in Slack. And so again, it's this little tactic I use, but it's a way, it's like kind of like if you were just walking through an office, you'd be like, oh, there's Ash. He's clearly, I don't know what, he's clearly working on something. So it's a little strategy that I'll use again. So people in Pacific time zone, cool. I want them to get it at 10. People East Coast, I want them to get it at 10 their time, not 2 p.m. or 1 p.m. And same thing with email, right? And sometimes I'll do that because I want it to arrive at a certain time. But some of it is also, again, humans and reinforcing behavior. If someone sends me an email and they just happen to catch me in the moment when I was in my email working through stuff, I don't want them to now expect that if I send Ash an email, I'm going to get a response within 15 minutes. Yes. So even if it works out that way, I might schedule that email to send in 2 hours, 3 hours, sometimes the next morning, because I want to reinforce what's the normal expectation, as well as maintaining visibility in some of those platforms.
So you said two things there. So I just want to, because you got a lot here. So, and I want you to hold on to the thought you have, but you said two things that are really important, I think. One, you talked about maintaining visibility, right? And you gave some concrete examples of that with the scheduling. And so that's a way to show that you're doing work, that you're adding value, even though people can't physically see you. So that's one power tip. And then the other is you are setting what I call your rules of engagement. So you're letting people know, essentially, even though you haven't explicitly communicated this, you're letting people know what to expect in terms of when they can hear from you, like during what range of hours they can hear from you, right? And what is a reasonable response time in which they're going to be able to hear back from you, right? So you're doing two of those. You're doing those two things with this one tactic. Is there anything more you want to say about that? You had another thought?
Well, I just think it's helpful because, again, there's a lot of different meanings for people, right? Instant messaging, it's a great tool. It's a necessary part of this larger suite. Somehow people just assume it's a replacement for real-time conversation, and it's not, because the reality is you might send me a message, Meico, and so you're like, we're having a real-time conversation just through digital tools. And the reality is like, nope, just because you like, I'm in a meeting, I'm over here on this call, or I'm in this event. It's like, if we were in person, you would be able to see that. And so this mismatch of expectations and the stress that can create for people where folks feel like, well, I know I'm on this event, but I have to multitask in case someone sends me an instant message during this hour. I have to, and it's like, no, you need to give focus and weight to where you are to do your good work. And so clarifying and reinforcing those expectations, I think, are helpful, because again, and this is where it bleeds into the extra hours. And people are like, oh, someone sent me a Slack message at 6 p.m. my time. They expect me to respond instantly. And I'm like, I'm eating dinner with my family. And so being explicit as a group, but that culture, which is how people actually live and work, right? Of don't feel bad if someone sends you communications during the time when you're not intending to respond. Just don't. And I guarantee after a couple of tries, they'll stop sending you stuff in the evening, because you're not going to get it anyways. So if they can see, oh, they always just respond the next morning anyways, I'll just send it in the morning because that's when I'm going to get my response. So a little bit of this, how do we train each other to respect boundaries, is also what feels like practical.
Yes.
No way to kind of, nobody should be giving away extra hours.
Yes.
Like, there's the goal of more productivity. Nothing says a remote person needs to be more productive than anyone else.
Yes.
I don't know why that somehow became a norm.
So let me ask you this, diving deeper into this setting expectations. So in your context and with your team, is it explicit? Do you all have discussions as teams and as individuals about these are my hours of availability? I'm going to use, are people using their way message on Slack to say like I'm in a meeting, or I'm away from 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. Or is it more each person is sort of doing what you're saying? It sounds like it's a more of an indirect way where you're setting expectations. It's not spoken, but you're setting expectations based on how you're choosing to respond as things come up. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. So the way we approach it is that we have sort of a flexible schedule in the sense that because we work across all time zones in the US, we expect there to be overlap from 9:30 in the morning until 2. Like generally people are available during that time to collaborate and work with each other. How you fill your hours outside of that overlap is up to you. So for me, I wake up super early. So it also means that typically by 2:30, 3 o'clock, my brain's done. So I just stop working. So that's how I kind of get it. So we do talk out loud. We're very clear that like nobody is expected to respond after hours or anything like that. But what we do is allow the freedom to say, like, for me, again, when I'm done working, I'm pretty well disconnected from tech. But I have some colleagues and they work differently, and like they're definitely not morning people. So if they have a thought or a question or something that pops up for them at 9 o'clock at night, it's totally fine for them to drop it in Slack. But they also fully understand that there's no way I'm responding to it until I get back the next day. Yes. So it's a bit of behaviors, but allow the freedom for each individual to kind of function in the way they do. But on a pretty regular basis, just out loud as a team reinforcing, just because I choose to work at 9 p.m. at night doesn't mean I expect anyone else to respond at 9 p.m. at night. And you got to do that on a regular basis, because we can all say one thing, but you don't want that doubt, especially now that we're distributed, right, to creep in and people feel like, well, I know they say that, but do they really expect it? And so you gotta keep reinforcing, work how you need to, but understand collectively this is where we're at.
So a lot there, and I see Carlos is on the screen, and I want to get to you, Carlos, but I want to make this point before I lose it with Ash. So can you speak to 2 points? So the first is, as a manager, the message that you send, if you're the person sending that message at 9 p.m., even if you don't want the person to respond, even if you don't expect them to respond. So that's the first part. Then the second is, what's the advice to someone that doesn't work at NTEN and they're not at an organization that is having those explicit conversations, and there is this unwritten expectation? How do you change that dynamic? So, but starting with the first part, you're a manager, you're sending emails, messages outside of quote unquote traditional office hours. What message do you have for those folks, and how can they change?
Yeah, so the first is a manager. So one is, and there's a number of folks on our team who will do this, to where if they are going to send a message late at night, the very first thing they put at the front of the message is, don't expect a response until tomorrow. So trying to, again, be explicit. The other thing is that myself personally, but even across the team, it like reinforcing this is another option where that scheduling tool can be helpful.
Yes.
Because, this thought popped into my brain at 9 p.m. at night. I can put it into Slack, but as I'm putting it in, I can set it so it still doesn't arrive to the other person until 8 a.m. the next day.
Yes.
So that's a way where, again, I can show some empathy for other folks, but still work however I want to.
Yes.
So there's a strategy. So for folks who don't work in a place where it is explicit, one is like, can you try? Can you just try and have that conversation out loud and be like, especially now that we're distributed, can we try and have a conversation about what are the norms and what's expected? And I think just trying to have the organization be honest then about what they're expecting, because there is this idea that, the needs are greater than ever, so somehow the hours need to be greater than ever. And I admit, right, there's certain times, it doesn't happen very often for me anymore, but there's some times where Like I put in extra time over the weekend because I got this presentation and I really sink time into my slides and all that. But, you know, to be honest, 1 hour of doing something when your mind is in the right place can be far more efficient and effective and produce better quality stuff than 4 hours when your brain just isn't in it.
Yes.
You're just not prepared to do it. So there's nothing that equates more hours to better outcomes or outputs.
Yes.
That seems to be this prevalent assumption where it's like, oh, I'll just push harder. And again, like in the afternoons, I don't do anything creative because I've come to learn about myself. After 2 o'clock, anything I try and create that's new is going to be such rubbish. I'm going to have to redo it the next day anyways. So it's like, oh, rather than spending 4 hours because I had to do it twice, I'm just going to hold off and do it tomorrow morning and only spend an hour, and it will still be better. So trying to get to a place where, one, you can know that about yourself, but two, can you just try and own it and have that out open conversation, which isn't always easy, but trying to have the conversation at least lets you know, is this something we as a group can work through? Or to be honest, is it something I'm going to have to try and use those like human hacks, right? Like,
Yes.
Am I going to have to come up with my workarounds to get around poor community culture or
Yes.
poor organizational structure? And at least know which game you're playing, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's very important. So the point you make about working longer and harder doesn't mean better results.
No.
And I think the other part in terms of shifting culture, one of the things I encourage people to do is to be vulnerable about the context in which you're operating, right? And to tapping into that empathy that you talked about earlier, which is that if you're able to say, if you're able to name why you need the flexibility that you need, in some cases that can help, right? So if you're like, look, I'm taking care of my mother who has dementia. I'm not able to do meetings at this time because we have to do X, Y, and Z. Like that is also a subtle way if people feel comfortable doing that in terms of shifting the dynamic. Because I think sometimes people are unaware of sort of the unconscious privilege that they have in terms of dictating, perhaps in an unintentional way, a schedule for someone else, not necessarily knowing the negative impact that it's having for other team members. And so if team members are feel like they are able to be vulnerable enough to share the context in which they're coming from, I found that can be helpful sometimes too.
Yeah, I think that leads to a really important point. And whereas a shift in sort of policies, right? So in a context where previously you had a couple of remote employees, like NTEN, we had 5 remote employees. So it's sort of the expectation that when you're on a video call, you turn your video on because it makes it more human and all that, right? So it's not a written policy, but it is kind of a normalized culture element. Well, that's all very different when you have people now working from home who, again, didn't do it intentionally. They're not doing that because, so for me, privacy used to be about just data. But now the reality is, look, if I wasn't planning on it and I wasn't set up to work from home and I'm now sitting at my kitchen table, I might not want you, my coworkers, in my personal space. I know you're cool seeing my kid run through the background, but maybe I don't want you seeing my kid. Maybe I don't want you here. And so being flexible enough to, again, to say like, normally this wouldn't be here, but you didn't choose to be at home. So for whatever reason, maybe you don't want your camera on.
Yeah.
And how that, again, relates to privilege, right? Like, we'll just go to a quiet space. You're like, are you kidding me? I live in 800 square feet. What do you?
And I'm sharing it with people, right?
Yeah. So like me coming from a super privileged spot, like I'm in my bedroom, right? Like LinkedIn world, you're in my bedroom. Like this, talk about blurring the lines between personal, right? So only through years of practice have I been able to figure out how to do it in a way where I'm comfortable. The first couple of years, I was terrible at this. It was so stressful trying to map that out. So imagine someone who didn't want it, got chucked into it 6-7 weeks ago.
Yes.
But just trying to acknowledge that like, if you had asked for it, you would have made sure you had a space and could do it all. But right now, yeah, maybe you're just typing in the chat because currently there's other things happening in your space and you're actually trying to be considerate of your coworkers, right? Like, you need a bunch of things in my background. You don't need to hear my partner and kids like chatting off screen.
Yes.
So what we can on sometimes, like if you're not coming from that place of empathy, you might assume, oh, this is them trying to step out, or they're not really paying attention. It's like, actually, they were just trying to go out of their way to be considerate of you and your time.
Yes.
So,
and I would add to that. So one of the things I found, and I've been doing a lot of extended trainings because my in-person engagements have been canceled. And so one of the things I do, it's a way to open up engagement. It's a way to lower the collective anxiety level. Is at the beginning of the training, I acknowledge the context in which we're operating. And I invite people. I say, if you have your kids, you have your cat, your dog, your goldfish, your plant, bring them into the training. This is the place for them. Like they can be a part of the experience too. And so I think I found that normalizes that. Actually, it breaks down a barrier that might otherwise get in the way of the learning experience that we're engaged in.
Yeah.
So Carlos, did you wanted to come back and you have a question that you wanted to, or comment you wanted to offer?
I slightly lost that, but I mean, I think what both of you were saying in this last point is probably two viable options, right? So one is normalizing the situation and the current settings that we are in, but also two, as Ash was saying, right, like just being mindful and respectful of the fact that somebody might not feel comfortable with normalizing their home and making it so accessible to people. So I think those two options, and for somebody that's managing a virtual team or remote workers, it's important to be thoughtful of those situations and those scenarios, and really not manage with a carte blanche in terms of like, this is how it has to be, and just understanding the individual sort of needs of the team members. I am actually now recalling my earlier thought, Ash, and I think you kind of asked this Meico this clarifying question around the idea of just coming out front to the team and sort of saying, here's some expectation settings around meeting, when communication is expected to be turned around. I love the question and clarifying question around like the non-NTEN organizations or teams, like how they can potentially start that conversation. I think you touched a little bit on it, Ash, but if maybe you can dive a little deeper in terms of like, I'm a right, like entry-level supervisor. I've got a team that I'm managing now virtually. What are some steps that this group can do if they're interested in to kind of dive into this expectation setting? If you might mind just maybe diving in a little more on that.
Yeah, I think it brings up some of the really important challenges happening right now, in that at this point, like a lot of us are about 2 months in. But a big barrier is this uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people are like, look, is this just something we need to tough out for 3 months? Is it something we need to create this wheeled alternate plan for that's for 9 months? Or is this forever changing the face of work, like so many blog posts have told me? So I think that barrier keeps a lot of people from just taking any step, any action to move forward. But what I think is important is, even if you're just looking at it, okay, maybe this is just a 4-month thing, maybe it's a 5-month thing. What are 1 or 2 things you could do right now to at least try and improve the short term? And then as you start looking at kind of intermediate to long term, starting to figure out, and what I think is a really important distinction that just seems lost in the moment, is that there's a big difference between a remote team versus a distributed team. And so even at NTEN, right, we had a remote team. So essentially what that is, right, there's a hub, there's an office, and to be honest, there's an identity that comes along with where home is. And then there's people who are remote. So there's this context of like, there's the main group, and then there's kind of others. There's folks that are outside the norm, even within the organization. And so there's adjustments and changes you make, and maybe there's that flexible schedule of people who work from home once or twice a week. There's very subtle but really powerful difference when you start saying we're actually a distributed team. Like a lot of organizations right now, they're like, oh, our lease was about to run up, so we're just not going to renew. And it's like, okay, but when everyone's distributed, for that to be successful, right, a lot of things have to be equalized.
Yes.
Your organizational structures, the culture, the kind of hierarchy, the power plays, all those things that go into place, they are significantly different if you're thinking distributed versus remote. And so I think for organizations to start thinking about it, this moment where it's probably not there yet, but as you start to get an understanding of going forward, are we going to give a remote option? Are we just going to be distributed? Owning the ripple effect that comes out of that. There's definitely some pros, but there's some cons. Again, like if you've got 3 or 4 levels to your hierarchy in your organization, those power plays and sort of who has what influence is amplified in all kinds of, to be honest, ugly ways if you're trying to work with a fully distributed model. So a lot of those equity issues, they become that much harder to try and deal with. If you have a structure that doesn't include power, but your culture really is about power and roles and that sort of stuff. So for organizations, again, that want to start thinking about it, making the shift, again, what's 1 or 2? Don't think about how you have to change everything about your culture, right? There's a lot of surveys that have come out recently, and one of the biggest fears that come both from individuals and from organizations is they feel like this is going to have a negative impact on culture. And for me, I'm like, that's sort of a smokescreen for, culture is about how we work. It shouldn't be about where we work. And so for me, it comes down to, you're probably not as intentional about your organizational culture as you think you are. And that's what's really at the base of this fear, this roadblock or barrier. Yeah. And so just starting to own that conversation. And again, I think in the context makes a lot of sense where we're talking about inequalities and oppressive systems, the way we've actually organized ourselves. It's like, yes, as a larger society, those are there. All of our organizations live within that larger society as well. So your structure, the way you distribute, who gets a full home office versus who simply got the $20 webcam.
Yes.
Was it about roles? Was it about inequality? Do you have policies that require people are on camera? And again, everybody's coming from a different context, right? As a white male, there's different expectations. Like, I just show up in a t-shirt and it's fine. But I read some really interesting articles lately. It was like those different expectations for different folks and how that plays out on a video call, right? Yes. Not only do I have to dress a little more professional to get respected, my house now has to also look a little more upscale to feel like I'm respected by my professional peers. Yes. It plays out in a lot of weird ways. And so I think people have to have those hard conversations, and you got to be able to own, whether intended or not, like how is the way we've structured things reinforcing some of those issues.
Yes. And so you said a lot there. So I'm just going to summarize it by saying that having Zoom and Slack is not enough for your team. When we talk about a virtual team or remote team or distributed team, and that the culture, so the invisible part is really the hard part, right? And the way I would describe it is when I work with organizations, I talk about getting clear about what your intention is, getting clear about who the people are that are aligned with that intention, what's the process, and then once you figure those things out, then we can talk about technology. Technology is the last thing that we're talking about in that formula. So it's talk about your intention. What is it that you're intending to do? What's the outcome that you are driving toward? Who are the people that are going to be involved in being on the bus or being a part of that team? What's going to be the process as the people work together? So I guess the way that it's like you're describing that as the culture, right? How are you going to work together? And then the last part is like, then which tools are we going to use to help us facilitate us working together, and whether it's in person, distributed, or remote. So very important, very powerful.
Yeah, there's a reason it goes people, process, tools.
Yeah.
Tools should be the caboose. They only help you do something. So if you're not clear on what it is you're trying to do, if I go buy a hammer because the hammer's great, and then I get home and figure out I'm trying to make a sandwich.
Yes.
it's not going to do anything, and it's certainly not going to help me accomplish my goals. So yeah, it loops back to the earlier point where we were discussing that focus on outputs. Same thing. If you're focused on needs and goals as you approach your people and process, tech could be a lot of different solutions despite the many blog posts and free webinars that rolled out that was like, here's the 5 tools you must have. To be honest, you can do a lot with pencil and paper. Right? Like Zoom backgrounds are great, but send a physical postcard to someone that you're managing just to be like, hey, just want you to know I still see you. You know, hope everything's going well on your side of the country. You know, the needs and goals should still supersede any sort of tools or tech you're going to throw at stuff. Yes,
so important. So in the few moments that we have left, I do want to spend some time talking about specific tools and strategies.
Yeah.
So before we were setting up in the green room, you were giving us the lowdown on one of the newest tools that you are talking about. So I wonder if you could share that, and if there's anything else you want to share by way of tools and tricks related to this issue of remote work, or just in general, just in terms of efficiency and productivity that you might want to share.
Yeah, I love getting into the nitty gritty. And so again, as you and I have talked about over the years, right, one of the biggest things about being efficient and effective is based in self-reflection, to be honest. And so for me, it comes down to a lot of times figuring out like, what is it? And it's not about productivity in terms of like, how many widgets do you pump out during your day? But in terms of honestly, like, I want to feel good about the time I spent and the change I was able to make happen. So for me, it's about kind of like, how can I focus in a way where I feel more effective towards the mission and the work? Yes. And so trying to identify what are the things that break my focus. And so it was a while ago, a couple of years ago, I realized email was a nightmare for me. That email and going in there constantly throughout the day, because we used to use Google Chat. So that lived inside of email. So anytime I got a message, I found myself actually inside of email. Yes. And all it did is it was this constant reminder of how much I had not accomplished and how much I still had to do. And so eventually we changed our tools and stuff. So our chat no longer lives in email. So I only go in email when I want to actually focus on that. And it was amazing the change that had for me, and feeling like I wasn't failing, to be honest. I felt like I was failing at my job when I had to look at my email every day, every 10 minutes. But I realized that my calendar was now doing the same thing, because we always have meetings. So I just kind of always up on a screen, so I can easily get to the Hangout link or the Zoom link, right? So I found every 10 minutes I was in my calendar. And so every 10 minutes, my brain was capturing everything I had to do in my entire week. And I felt like that just constantly disrupted my flow. So one specific tool I found just at the beginning of last week is called Meter. And I think it might just be an iOS app. It might work on Windows and PC as well. But basically what it does is, up in my little menu, it just has this little prompt that only shows me my next meeting, the next thing on my calendar coming up. And then if I click on it, it will show me my events for the day, and it only has a button that says join meeting, and it hooks into like 8 platforms. So like Meet, Zoom, Skype, all that kind of stuff. So I can accomplish those goals of very easily getting into the meeting link for what I need. But what I found is I don't have my calendar open. So I can easily see, this is what I'm doing now. This is kind of what's coming next, so I can get my brain prepared, or know like, oh, I should probably spend a few minutes getting ready for that meeting or that call. That's it. And so I only go to my calendar now if it's like, oh, okay, well, I want to schedule this thing with someone. So I go there for that. And it's been this like breath of fresh air to not be consumed by everything, and feeling like I can really just focus on what I'm trying to put my energy into now and what comes next. And that's it. So that's been, and it's a free app. So again, okay. It lives in the realm. This is not some fancy enterprise. It was just a free app. It's amazing, to be honest, in terms of feeling like I'm actually doing good work throughout my day. It's easily given me back an hour a day. How often I find myself just standing here going, oh, it's only Tuesday and I'm already sweating things I'm supposed to do on Friday. It's like, okay, well, there goes 15, 20 minutes of just dread. And now I don't have to kind of deal with that as much.
That's awesome. So you mentioned, as a setup for this, you talked about the email distraction. What have you been able to do for the email distraction? What strategy, what tool are you using for that?
We use G Suite as like our backbone thing, right? So essentially I'm in Gmail. So
yeah.
I've figured out basically like a simple label process, to where there's a label for action someday, and then I star things. And to be honest, that's it. So I jump in and I'll just like process, put things where they need to be. And then I'll come back later in the day where it's like, cool, I've got a 30-minute window between meetings. I'm not going to be creative. So I can go in and, I work through my starred stuff. And then after that I work, so I know what my priority is to work through the labels. But that way I'm not looking at this like overflowing inbox.
Yes.
I could just process it real quick. And then it's like, I got 30 minutes. I'm going to focus on that and then step back out. So again, I pretty much only jump into email if I need to do what email is designed for, not task management, not calendar management, none of that sort of stuff.
Okay. So you mentioned processing. So I'm curious what your process is for that. So I'm in Gmail too, and I use the multiple inboxes feature to auto sort things into different, I guess, folders or inboxes, the way that the jargon that Gmail uses. So essentially what that does is, for me, like I use for newsletter subscriptions, for receipts and confirmations, I have all those automatically go to a different inbox, so that the main inbox is just things that require action. So what does your process look like when you actually are looking at your inbox?
I use the social and the promotions tab in Gmail again as a way to be like, so similar to do that, but I'm also a huge fan of the filters. So again, I have a lot of things where it's like, if it's a receipt, it actually, I don't need to read that except for once a month when I need to process it. So like before it ever hit the inbox, it went over, it got this label, it got marked as read. And I just know like, I will look at it when I need it, but otherwise I don't need to process it every single time that receipt comes in for that monthly subscription.
Yes.
So there's another way again where like, if it arrives in the inbox, it's because it's somehow new or it's something that I have to think about to prioritize. But anything that's like regular and predictable, it never actually arrives at the inbox.
So this is key. So for folks that are looking at this, no matter which email platform you use, one of the ways that you're going to save time is to, if I'm understanding you, Ash, correctly, it sounds like we use a similar process, which is to minimize the amount of time you actually spend thinking about what to do with the email in your inbox. And one of the ways you're going to do that is by figuring out what are the predictable things in your inbox, what are the things that show up repeatedly over and over again, and filtering those things automatically. So you can set up filters. You can use in Gmail the multiple inboxes, but essentially every email platform that you're using has some way to filter, to auto tag, to put things and sort things into different folders. Is that about right, Ash?
Yeah, I think you summarized it very well. And I can't emphasize enough, like figuring out my email is the biggest tech stress win I've had in the last 5 years. I mean, it really was this thing that made me feel like I was failing every day. And I just set up this little system and it completely changed how I approached like my day. So if you haven't figured one out, whatever time it takes, I swear you'll get that back in years on your soul, but it is worth figuring out the email.
So there's a study on this. So one study that I saw showed that we spend about 50% of our time, of our work time, either reading email, responding to email, or thinking about it, right? And so imagine
thinking about it.
Yeah. So imagine what you could do if you could get back half your time if you could figure out some of the email things. So yeah, it was very, very important. So I know that we are almost out of time, and I see Carlos is on the screen. Is there anything else you want to leave us with in terms of a tip or a hack, for folks that are watching us, Ash?
Again, it feels like it should be technology, right? But to be honest, the most important thing I think you can focus on as an individual and what you can support as an organization around remote or distributed work, self-reflection. To be honest, that the more you can identify what your challenges and your needs are, the more likely and the quicker you're gonna figure out what it is. So to be honest, again, tech comes at the end of it. And self-reflection is the biggest thing you can focus on to help address, honestly, every other challenge I think comes off of that. Trust, communication, collaboration. Until you love yourself, you can't love others. It's the same point, right?
Yes.
If you love yourself, everything else will come together.
And I always say that our best app is our internal app. And so you're spot on with that, Ash. So thank you for that. Carlos, do you want to add anything to this?
I mean, Ash, what I was going to chime in on earlier was this idea of like mail management and right. I mean, I think what you touched on, Ash, was this idea of how can we make life simpler and not being so dependent on emails. The coupling of like a Slack tool for instant messaging plays a key role in that as well in some instances. So just the idea and part of what I've seen teams do is really use and leverage email for all external facing type communication. So ideally your team, your organization has a venue through like Slack or through an instant message to have those dialogues and not bog down emails as they're coming into your mailbox. And then really when you get down to getting to your mailbox, then what should be in there in theory is stuff that's external facing, that's really perhaps time sensitive and does require like the targeted attention and creativity that a team or a member might need.
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
That's spot on. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think in both instances, the key to making both of those work is, again, the expectations piece. So Ash, you talked about this earlier, just being clear about as a team and as an organization, okay, so we have this distinction between internal and external communication, internal being the Slack and external being the email, but let's be clear about expectations, right? So if we're going to be using Slack for internal, are we expecting folks to spend every waking day responding to Slack messages, you know? So being clear about what that is. So I want to thank you, Ash, for joining us and being a part of this conversation. I feel like we just barely touched the surface, and we'd love to have you back on to dive a little bit deeper into some of these topics. Is there anything else you want to share with our audience before we sign off?
No, just I appreciate again you two holding space for this conversation, and again getting through the initial crush of everything that hit, and let's get past put some pants on, or buy this like $400 backlight because that's what makes your video calls great. And get down to the like, how do we as humans continue to do really important work at the moments it's desperately needed by the communities we're serving. I'll do these conversations with you all day. I love hanging out with you too, and being able to just have real open, honest conversations like this.
Well, awesome. Well, we appreciate you and your openness and candor, just being generous in your sharing. Folks, this has been Ash Shepard, Chief Program Officer with NTEN. We're super excited to have him here. And again, thank you to our digital producer, Carlos Gonzalez, for joining us, making the studio look beautiful, running everything so smoothly. And I am your host, Meico Marquette-Whitlock, founder and CEO of MindfulTechie. I want to thank you for joining us today. I want to invite you to like, love, share, comment, tag someone that you love, that you care about, who could use this information that we share today. And join us back here again next week. We're going to be here again on Tuesday, 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Pacific Time, for another deep conversation at the intersection of mindfulness, technology, and well-being. Thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, guys. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.